Hello, everyone. So it looks like it's noon, so we'll get started now. We've had a bit of a hiatus with the CRWDP webinars. A lot has obviously been going on in the world, but today we have a really exciting talk. I'm really happy to get to introduce Amy Sheppard. Amy is a PhD candidate in the Faculty of Sociology at Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador. She's a practicing social worker at a nonprofit working with women in the criminal justice system. Her research and clinical interests focus on gender, criminalized women, trauma-informed practices, as well as critical obesity or fat studies. Amy is an avid amateur dancer, which I think is pretty important information, and she also dabbles in backyard homesteading. And now, Amy, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Dan. You can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to acknowledge, I guess, first how supremely awkward this is for me. So since this COVID stuff all happened, I've started to use Zoom a lot more, but I've never done a presentation where I'm just sort of talking to myself. So I'm just picturing all of you nodding and smiling and at all the brilliant things I'm going to say. So today my presentation is called The Big Iceberg Under That Water, Formerly Imprisoned Women's Experiences of Reentry. So just to let you know a little bit of what I'm going to talk about. A statement of the problem, just to let you know what that's about, where I'm coming from with my research. I'll do a brief outline of my theoretical framework, the methods and participants of my study. I'll share some of my findings and then conclusions and thoughts for future work. I also just really want to note right now, I am currently working on my dissertation. I'm currently coding and analyzing data. So these are really initial findings, and I'd be really interested in hearing any sort of feedback or observations anyone has at the end of the presentation. So these are basically my research questions that are guiding my project. I'm interested in the impacts of mental health and addiction on the movement towards a crime-free lifestyle. I'm interested in particularly on desistance experiences of women, and I will explain desistance a little further in the slides. And I'm interested in how employment and mental health, or how employment is impacted for women with mental health concerns and criminal records. So in particular, I think of interest to this presentation is around how mental health issues, mental health disability, and criminal records intersect to impact employment. So in essence, the problem is that numbers of women prisoners are growing in Canada, which means there are also increasing numbers of women coming out of prisons. So women who are have experienced prison, have histories of trauma, substance use, mental health concerns, and then that can impact their ability to lead a crime-free lifestyle once released from prison. And certainly there are programs and services in place to help women on release. However, there's a lack of knowledge tied to understanding how women's experiences both within and outside prison shape their ability to engage in a crime-free lifestyle when released from prison. So desistance, broadly understood, is the multifaceted process by which persons who have transgressed the law disengage from a criminal lifestyle and begin to live as law-abiding citizens. That definition comes from Shad Maruna in his work in 2001. And I do have a slide on desistance further on in the presentation. But what's missing from this discussion of desistance, again, this process of disengaging from a criminal lifestyle, is a link towards the impacts of mental health and addiction on the movement towards a crime-free lifestyle. So scholars have not really addressed mental health and addiction too much in the desistance literature. Furthermore, there's a lack of a focus on the desistance experiences of women, and that's certainly because there are a lot more male prisoners than there are female prisoners. So Peggy Giordano and her colleagues have looked at desistance from a gender-informed perspective. However, I must really acknowledge that women in prison are disproportionately affected by mental health concerns in comparison to women in the general public. Additionally, female prisoners are much more likely to have experienced abuse and trauma, and many women report coping with their abuse by using alcohol, drugs, or engaging in self-harm behavior. So then my question is, how do mental illness and drug addiction affect women's prisoners' ability to achieve desistance and plan for their future? So that's where this research is coming from. This presentation focuses on the intersection of mental health disability and a criminal record and the impacts of employment as a part of re-entry. And so my initial findings show that stigma and gender roles impact how formerly incarcerated women are able to access employment. So I just want to share a little here about why I'm doing this research, where I come from, and why this particular issue. So I do work as a social worker at a nonprofit here in St. John's, Newfoundland. It's called Stella Circle. And our mission is to provide adults who face barriers to fully participating in their community. And barriers can include mental health challenges, addiction, trauma, poverty, homelessness, criminal justice involvement, low literacy, and long periods of employment. So in particular, I work with a program that works with criminalized women. It's called the Just Us Women's Center. And it was established in 2009 to meet an identified need for criminalized women in the St. John's and at the Newfoundland and Labrador Correctional Center for Women. So the program I work for provides services 3 days a week at the Correctional Center for Women. So that's the work I do. I do therapeutic group work, as well as assessments and support for release planning. In addition to that work in the prison, our center also provides services to women in the St. John's community. So that includes, again, therapeutic group work, individual counseling, as well as practical supports, help with housing, clothing, toiletries, referrals for employment programs, as well as stuff like access to computers and telephones. We also run an informal peer support network through a drop-in and a weekly supper. And of course, participation in our program is voluntary. So I have been working with this program as a social worker for the past 11 years. And again, my focus is more on the clinical therapeutic sort of role, the counseling piece of it. So when thinking about a research project for my PhD work, I wanted a project that would benefit the women I work with. And throughout my work at the prison, I have developed relationships with women serving time there. And I've really grown to care about these women, both as individuals and as a group who face a great deal of stigma and challenge. I've had the privilege to learn from women with whom I work and the privilege to pass these learnings on to the women who come after them. And this is a group that faces a great deal of stigma, and I see a part of my role, both as a social worker and as a researcher / student, as an advocate for those women in prison. I want to show the public that they are not, like some have described, monsters or deviants, throwaways, or poor lost souls. They are women with stories, making choices, living life as best they can while tangled in an unforgiving system. And given my work as a social worker, I feel like I can use what I've learned through this research to change my own practice to better meet the needs of women leaving prison, and as well to advocate for systemic changes. So just a little more context. This picture here is the Newfoundland and Labrador Correctional Center for Women. This is where all women who serve provincial sentences in Newfoundland and Labrador would serve their time. So just to provide a little bit of background about Canada's correctional system, I'm not sure if most people would know about it. We do have two systems of corrections, provincial and territorial, and federal. So anyone who gets a sentence of less than 2 years would serve a provincial or territorial sentence and serve time in correctional institutions run by provincial or territorial governments. For those sentenced to longer terms, over 2 years, they're referred to as federally sentenced and serve time at prisons operated by Correctional Services of Canada. So, as I said, women from Newfoundland and Labrador serve provincial sentences at the Newfoundland and Labrador Correctional Center for Women, which is a bit of a mouthful. It's located in Clarenville, which is about 2 hours outside of St. John's, which is the capital of Newfoundland and Labrador, and of course where most of our population would be. This prison has 28 beds. However, it has had as many as 40 women at one time, which is definitely overcrowding. And when there are that many women there, it does mean that they're triple bunked, which means that there are some women sleeping on mattresses on the floor. Currently, there's around 12 women. Things drastically changed after COVID happened. And just to put this in a bit of context, these are really, really low numbers compared to male prisoners. So, for example, we have 4 male prisons here in Newfoundland and Labrador compared to this one that we have for women. And just to further reiterate, all women from Newfoundland and Labrador serve their sentences here, including women from Labrador. They would need to leave by plane to come down to Newfoundland to serve their sentences, whereas men in Labrador have a correctional center there. So women from this province serving federal time, which is a sentence of more than 2 years, have to go to Nova Institution in Truro, Nova Scotia, or they could go to another institution in Canada. However, the intention of Correctional Services Canada is for women to serve their time as close to home as possible. And a lot of times women who've served federal time will have served considerable amounts of time here at the Newfoundland and Labrador Correctional Center for Women, either on remand, which means they're waiting for their trial, or waiting for transportation to go to the federal institution. So the majority of women prisoners do serve their time pretty far away from home communities. That's true of Newfoundland and Labrador in particular, but in Canada generally. So I want to just share a little bit about the theoretical framework that guides my research. So desistance is the theoretical framework, and then I'm going to share a little bit about reentry needs for female prisoners. So as I stated earlier, desistance is broadly understood as a multifaceted process by which persons who have transgressed the law disengage with a criminal lifestyle and begin to live as law-abiding citizens. And it certainly is a debated process. However, scholars of desistance state that former prisoners tend to move towards a crime-free, pro-social life as they age and mature, developing strong bonds of attachment, including marriage and employment. And other theorists argue that those strong bonds are really important, marriage and employment. However, a cognitive shift must occur within a desister to signify that such bonds have developed and are meaningful. As such, a desister's self-narrative has undergone a gradual shift towards a pro-social lifestyle. And that's really where I'm coming from, is this idea of a cognitive shift. It's not just that someone got married, or it's not just that they found a job. It's this idea that they had to have a shift in the way of thinking in order to make those things happen. So there is a really important link between desistance and employment. And a key finding within the desistance literature is that connection between employment and desistance. Scholars have theoretically connected employment and crime for more than half a century, suggesting that having a job, indifferent to one's crime, serves as a protective factor against criminal acts. And the consensus among scholars remains that employment is a preventative factor against criminal activity and a variable that provides insight into the risk of recidivism. And so through my work with criminalized women, I'm really interested in employment and how women have been able to engage in employment. So many women over the years have talked to me about difficulties in getting work post-incarceration. Also, in doing this work for a lot of years, I've seen a number of women be able to engage in employment and that really positive impact that it has for them. And it goes just beyond just financial. Well, certainly that's a benefit. Employment provides meaning for women, connection, and a sense of giving back. So who are these women in prison and where are they coming from? What are their sort of concerns? In general, both male and female prison populations are young, often poor, are underemployed or unemployed with little formal education, and their offenses usually include high levels of alcohol and drug use. However, women in prison differ from men in prison due in part to the wider marginalization of women in society. Women's needs are different due to issues with family relationships, housing, and poverty, as well as trauma histories which contribute to drug use and self-harming behaviors. So many women in prison are parents, and many were providing for their dependent children prior to entry into prison. And generally speaking, issues around custody and childcare are more concerned for women, female prisoners, than male prisoners. Women are more likely to lose housing than are men while in prison, as they are more likely to be single parents with their own name on the lease. And in general, this is the reality that I see a lot, is men are more likely to have a partner at home taking care of things, while women were the ones taking care of things on the outside, and sort of they're trying to maintain that while they're inside prison. While men in prison are often poor, underemployed, undereducated, women in prison have even lower levels of education, employment, and job skills than do male prisoners, and experience even more poverty and welfare dependence than do men. Incarcerated women experience high rates of mental health problems, including PTSD, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, schizophrenia, mood disorders, and personality disorders. And numerous researchers have indicated that the majority of women in prison have experienced trauma in their lives, often in multiple instances, and at the hands of multiple perpetrators. So, for example, within Canada, 33% of women imprisoned in federal prisons have been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. That's significant. However, I also note that many more women report histories of sexual abuse, 68%, and physical abuse, 86%, than have been diagnosed with PTSD. So it's possible that many more women are suffering due to trauma histories than are formally diagnosed with PTSD. And while indeed men in prison have experiences of trauma, trauma itself is a gendered concept in how symptoms are expressed, in types of trauma suffered, and in treatment. So often women turn pain from trauma inward and use drugs or alcohol or self-harming behaviors to cope. And so many women in prison are forced to undergo withdrawal from drug use while in prison. So not only do women experience that pain of detox, then they also have to face those issues that the drugs have been numbing. Women are more likely than men to engage in self-harming behaviors. So it's apparent that women respond to and experience prison differently than do men. However, women's responses to pains of imprisonment and their trauma histories are often interpreted as a pathology, deeming women in prison as, quote, disordered and disorderly women. That comes from Pollock, 2005. And this has led to a history of controlling women through medication and a vision of women in prison as high needs and difficult to manage. And it's sort of interesting to note here in Newfoundland and Labrador, our prison system has actually been really criticized for not providing medications to prisoners, whereas much of the literature I've seen in other parts of Canada, Correctional Services Canada has been really criticized for providing too much medication to prisoners. So it's just an interesting difference here in Newfoundland and Labrador. So additionally, women prisoners have social capital deficit. They are not tied to networks for employment and financial assistance and will return home with the same lack of resources, and now, of course, they have a prison record. Women prisoners have been subject to complex, interrelated types of social disadvantage amounting to deep exclusion. So just to start now about what I did with my research. So I interviewed two groups of participants, formerly incarcerated women and service providers who work with these women both in community and in prison. And I elected to interview from these two groups because each provides insight into the challenges of, as well as what might work within the reentry process for women leaving prison and returning to the St. John's area. Interviewing formerly incarcerated women aids in understanding challenges in transitioning from prison back to community from their unique perspective, as each woman has a different experience. Service providers have the experience of working with numerous criminalized women and can provide a wealth of information from working with a diverse population. Service providers who work closely with criminalized and imprisoned women also provide their perspectives on the challenges associated with providing services to women on reentry, including systemic barriers. So I interviewed 17 formerly incarcerated women and 16 service providers. And this is just a picture I took off the internet. This is not the women I interviewed, just to be really clear. So questions for formerly incarcerated women focused on plans that they had for release while they were incarcerated and how those plans have fit with the reality of their lives now. I asked women to share their histories and goals, as well as what they see as barriers to achieving those goals and their potential to overcome obstacles. So women interviewed were from all over Newfoundland and Labrador, but all interviews did occur in St. John's, so all the women had moved to St. John's, and many as a way to access more services. The length of time since incarceration varied. So I interviewed a couple women who were just out a couple of days, and one woman had been out 10 years since her incarceration. Length of sentences also varied, with one woman spending a few days in lockup before being released on house arrest, and another woman spending 8 years in prison. Criminal offenses included serious crimes such as arson and manslaughter, as well as crimes like drug trafficking, fraud, and shoplifting, which would be more economically motivated. Ages of women interviewed range from 21 to 79, and 2 women identified as Indigenous. The other 15 women self-identified as white. All women identified as having a mental illness. I interviewed 16 service providers, and I asked them about types, quality, and access to services available to women within the prison and after leaving prison. In addition, I asked them to describe what they've observed about policies and practices for criminalized women and how such policies and practices could improve. My conversational interviews with service providers examined barriers in the areas of community connections, such as employment, mental health services, and housing. All service providers were based in St. John's, although some organizations do provide provincial services. They work with marginalized populations who experience mental health and addictions issues, homelessness, poverty, racism, and who are often street entrenched and have high needs. Service providers had a range of tenure in the field from 3 months to 12 years. All had earned a bachelor's degree with some specialized fields such as social work or occupational therapy. And services offered varied. Some service providers perform prison in-reach as a regular part of their job, while others work with women post-release. While not all service providers were mandated to work specifically with criminalized women, the types of services provided meant that criminalized women used those services. So now I want to share some initial findings. So this is just some stuff I'm finding interesting. Again, more analysis needs to be done. This is a quote from Gloria. She said, that's only one tip of the iceberg, but there's a big friggin' iceberg under that water you got to deal with. Yeah, and it's not easy. Okay, like if I wasn't so determined as I was when I got out of jail, I would probably be back in there. And just to note, all quotes use pseudonyms. So in this slide, Gloria is referring to dealing with her mental illness as the tip of the iceberg. She says that for many people, they think that dealing with the issues that are apparent on the surface will solve all their problems. For example, addiction or getting a job, and that will just be the answer and everything will sort of fall into place. However, what Gloria asserts here is that those issues go much deeper. And I picked this quote because I think it demonstrates what I found, that the issues go much deeper. There's a criminal record, there's mental illness, there's addiction, there's issues related to gender, poverty, and often you see one issue sort of bobbing at the top, but all those other issues are underneath, unseen. I also like this imagery of the iceberg sort of tying to Newfoundland and Labrador, which is where I am, of course. So, what do women say that they need? This is what came out through my research. Women say they want work. Most women were seeking or have sought employment or volunteer work. They see it as a meaningful connection to community, as well as an opportunity for money and an opportunity to disengage from a criminal lifestyle. And I'll talk a little further about employment in the next slide. Women say they want to give back. Most women are very aware that they have taken something from society and really want to give back, and to a lot of them talk about wanting to help other women who are going through the same situation that they've been through. Women talked about wanting more services. They said that existing services are good, they just need more of them. So for example, they need stuff, mental health services in particular, on weekends and evenings. An interesting thing that came up through my research and has come up through my professional life too, is a lot of women talk about how jail helps save their life. So a couple women in particular told me it gave them sober time, and it allowed them to think and make a plan. And I think that that can be really problematic to hear as a service provider, and problematic to hear as an academic, that jail, helps save someone's life. And I think we really need to listen to that. What is it that women are saying when they say jail is helpful? And what does that mean for advocacy, programming, and policy development? So what is it about jail that women say was actually really, really helpful? And then are there ways to meet those needs in less punitive ways? That's something I need to think a little bit more about, or just think about. So other things that women talked about were gender-specific services. They identified fear and discomfort around men for some services, and I will talk about that further on in the presentation. Women talked about needing peer support, hearing from another woman who's been through the same experience, walking with someone who's been on the same path, and they mean that both metaphorically and literally. They literally want women to go with them to different groups or different services. They just want a buddy. Women want access to community, and housing came up as a major issue throughout my research. We do not have a halfway house for women in Newfoundland and Labrador, which means that when women come out of prison, there's no sort of transition place for them to go. That has huge impacts on the ability to find and maintain employment. If you have nowhere to live, it's really hard to find a job. So just to speak to employment, Sylvie says, I will be finished school in May, and then I want to go on to do hair. I'll be able to say I'm on my own 2 feet 100%. I would like to move into a house and have my boys come in. So I'm just pulling this quote because it really highlights that employment goals are related to a feeling of pride and accomplishment, as well as future goals like caring for children. Meaning is attached to employment, not just a job for the sake of it. Just this idea that she'll be able to be a better mom when she is able to have a job. Sylvie does have a history of both addiction and mental illness, and she feels that those are both currently managed. And partly that is due to her routine of going to school. Mary is between 70 and 75. She's an older woman and is retired, but wants to keep volunteering. And she says, I try to keep busy every day, and I like volunteer work, but because of my prison thing, I can't. So this really highlights the importance of being active and giving back and feeling you're contributing to something. Mary has a history of mental illness. She sees a psychiatrist, but she says she doesn't really see the point. She believes that her mental illness would be better managed if she was able to volunteer and live what she considers to be a fuller life. And that's one way that I observe that mental illness and criminal record intersect, is that mental illness is really impacted by the criminal record because it impacts the ability to be employed, and employment impacts mental illness. So what are some of the barriers to employment? I noted practical barriers, that stigma is a barrier, and that gender roles can be a barrier. So these are some of the practical issues that I found. This is a quote from Hannah. She says, everything is amped up for people in prison. Okay, the poverty is amped up, the trauma is amped up, the addiction is amped up, everything is just amplified and much more difficult. So this quote, I think, just really highlights a lot of what I found throughout the research. So there are some policy and program barriers. The process of applying for a particular program can be a barrier, particularly when it comes to mental illness disability. It's a long process and it's a lot of work. So you need to prove you have a mental illness diagnosis, and a doctor needs to confirm that. And of course, that is a long process exacerbated by, again, more practical issues. And I mean, when I'm talking about this idea of applying for particular programs, I am talking about employment programs here in Newfoundland and Labrador. Now, all service providers I talked to did not have this barrier of needing a doctor's note, but if they needed to apply for funding, that's where that issue came from. Housing, like I said, is a major practical issue for women coming out of prison. As I said, we lack a halfway house for women in Newfoundland and Labrador, so tracking women down once they leave prison can be really challenging. We do lack enough case management services, and there's more and more complex women who are presenting in prison with some pretty severe mental illness. Another sort of practical issue that I found, which I thought was quite interesting, was around the idea of defining mental illness. A lot of women I talked to didn't always agree with their mental health diagnosis, or they sort of didn't want to present themselves as having a mental health diagnosis. They want to kind of present themselves quite positively, so they wouldn't disclose everything that's going on. So if you don't disclose mental illness, then you can't access all the services that might be available to them. Another practical barrier, there is a lack of funding for assessments for particular disability, including learning disability, for example. Practical issues, again, included accessibility, that most services are available sort of 9 to 5. There's a lack of outreach. Women will have to go to services rather than services being available for them. Poverty is a major issue. One woman did tell me she did a course that was paid for by Correctional Services of Canada, but she doesn't have the money to pay for her driver's license, and that's what she needs to work. And so one of the things that I really struggled with in putting together this presentation was to kind of come up with an order of how I would present the information. And I think that struggle to put an order to it really highlights the issues at play here. There is no order. There's no one thing that sort of comes first. There's just that big and friggin' iceberg that Gloria talked about. So if you chip away at that iceberg, it'll tumble and turn, and then another issue arises. And as Hannah says here, everything is just amped up. So stigma came up a fair bit when I talked about criminal records and mental illness. So this is a quote from Lynn. She's a service provider. She said, "I met with her and built that therapeutic relationship. Then one day she was like, I have something to tell you." I was like, "Well, what are you going to tell me?" She's like, "I have a criminal record." And I was like, "Oh, now I know why you can't get a job. Why aren't you telling me this like months ago?" So Lynn is a service provider working within employment supports for people with mental health issues. And she's been working with this woman for over a year who was underemployed and couldn't figure out why. Eventually, her client disclosed a criminal record. So this client would go for interviews, be offered the job, but once they asked her for a record of conduct, she just wouldn't go back to the job. She was so ashamed of her criminal record that she wouldn't disclose that to service providers who were helping her. However, she was willing to talk about her mental illness and get some supports for mental illness. So I draw attention to this quote because certainly it impacts employment, but I also thought there was some interesting stuff going on here, and I thought it requires a little bit more thought and analysis on my part. So I have noticed in working with criminalized women that a lot of them are reluctant to share with me mental illness histories, even though a disclosure of mental illness could increase services. So I'm wondering if there's a sort of hierarchy of stigma for some people. Some see a criminal record as less problematic. Some people see a mental illness as less problematic. On the other hand, or this might be a form of stigma management. So to access my services, you have to have a criminal record, but to access Lynn's, you have to have a mental illness. So maybe people are reluctant to share a second stigmatizing identity when you disclose one by default. And so I'm just interested in this idea of a double stigma, and I want to explore that a little further. So certainly there is a lot of stigma around criminal record. Beth says, "I don't know the employment thing. It's probably a lot to do with me because I'm really nervous about people knowing, and it's not hard to Google." So Beth was convicted of a very serious charge, and when you Google her name, news articles come up with a picture of her and details about her conviction. So for Beth, she's really nervous about that, and she's reluctant to put herself out there for employment. So she also has mental illness, and that makes that problem worse in that the issue of disclosure really increases her mental health symptoms. So I also noted a lot of issues around gendered roles that came up throughout my research. So Allison here is a service provider, and she says, "So I see women who have criminal histories more marginalized, and I think really ghettoized than even into sex work. And not to say that there's anything wrong with sex work, and some women want to do that, but I know some I've worked with who just get into that because it's like, well, that's what I could get." So Allison here really highlights this idea of barriers for women who, with criminal histories, trying to get work. And Allison also told me that men are more likely to sort of circumvent some of those issues with regard to criminal records, with regard to mental illness, by working under the table or going into the traditional male fields where issues around criminal record in particular don't matter as much. However, traditional women's work is usually much more people focused. So positions of trust like cleaning or babysitting or home care. And so even under the table work is more challenging for women to be able to access. The other thing I note is that for women, a criminal lifestyle is also often really, really closely connected with a relationship. So lots of times the criminal lifestyle is really tied with a partner. And desisting then from a criminal lifestyle would involve a whole break free from a relationship as well. And so, of course, when most women talked about their goals, they tied goals, including employment, to family. So employment will help them be a better mother. So it's not just about the employment. So this is my final slide here about my findings. So Katie told me, "I have to go up there, a local nonprofit, and I'm frightened to death. I should have been there 3 weeks ago. Yeah, but I'm going. Yeah, I got to make myself go. Yes, I'm just afraid who I'm going to see up there. So Katie here is referring to a local nonprofit that provides a host of services to vulnerable and marginalized populations, including food, clothes, as well as medical and therapeutic services. And they do really good work, but many women I spoke to avoid this place because of the men who access services there. It's a small city and people easily run into people they know, including ex-partners, drug dealers. There's also a fear of running into men. There's a fear about running into men they know, but this place also has a reputation for some violent men that frequent the place. And women have also talked about the need for AA or NA and therapeutic services to be women-only spaces. There's a real discomfort in talking about personal issues and in particular trauma with men in the space. So where am I going from here? I'm really thinking a lot about how this impacts my own personal social work practice and the program I work. It might involve, making some shifts in how we do business in my workplace. And I'm really interested in this idea of the intersection of mental illness and criminal record. And just digging a little further into that, I'm still not quite done all the coding and the analysis of that yet. But one of the things that really has come up is this idea of multiple stigmatized identity and how that impacts employment. So I'm really interested in that idea of multiple impacts or multiple stigmatized identities and how people navigate that or manage stigma. And that is it. So questions or feedback, I'm happy to hear.
Amy, that was an amazing presentation. Thank you so much. It is not a world that I personally have much access to, so to see your talk, especially given your background in social work as well, was very meaningful, and I hope it was as well for our attendees. We do have 26 people here too, which is pretty exciting. Please feel free to ask your questions. And I also have one here from Kathy for you, Amy, so
Okay.
I'll just get to that. So Kathy said, "Thank you, Amy, for the very informative and engaging presentation. Could you give a bit more detail about perceptions of employers of hiring persons with a criminal record? And what do you think can be the success factors for finding a job for a woman after prison?"
Yeah, I can certainly speak to that. So I can speak to it both from a literature, sort of academic perspective, as well as from the perspective of service providers. So the Stella Circle, where I work, does actually have an employment division, and that's one of the major pieces of work they do, is helping to navigate when people have a criminal record and how to approach employers. So it's interesting, the literature kind of shows two sort of contradictory things. Apparently, a lot of employer would say they would hire people with a criminal record, but when it comes down to it, they don't often actually hire them. What we have found kind of locally is that employers who are locally based, as opposed to like a franchise or a company that has they're based out of the mainland and they have, a branch here, locally based employers are much more willing to give people a chance. And what we have also found is that if an individual will go to an interview and have the ability to sort of explain the circumstances, explain what they've worked on, explain their story a little bit, that human sort of face actually really impacts employers, and they're much more willing to give them a chance. So there is a woman I worked with, this a couple years ago now, but she had some fraud charges. She actually did serve nearly 2 years in our provincial system. And, she, prior to going to prison, she had a great work ethic and she had a really good resume. But when she got out of prison, she had a really hard time in finding employment because of her criminal record. And fraud can be really challenging in particular. But she did work with one of our employment counselors and kind of came up with a little bit of what's the right word? Speech, I guess, or an explanation as to, this is how I've changed. These are the things I'm working on. And she was able to get a job as a receptionist at a law office, which is a, pretty big position of trust. And she's been doing well ever since. Some of the issues with her were more around her coworkers than her employer. So there's lots of different kind of issues that would impact people's ability to get employment, and certainly coworkers would be one of them as well. Does that answer the question, Kathy?
Amy, thank you so much for responding. It does provide more background on probably the employer side of the things as well, because we are dealing with many different stakeholders in this situation. And thank you so much. I'm also I like the idea and your plan to explore double stigma or multiple stigma and how it affects different sides of life of people after prison. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. So we have another question here from Laura. Laura has said, I am a retired nurse, still working in occupational health and safety, and I have been a volunteer street outreach worker for the past 12 years. I see all of this every week on the streets for all genders. We have to change the way society views those with a criminal record. Unless there is a truly legitimate reason, once the time is served, they have paid their dues and shouldn't have to keep disclosing a criminal record that does not involve a violent crime or is sexual in nature. Even a violent crime in self-defense should not have to be disclosed if we expect people to have been rehabilitated and get on with their lives. They can't if they can't work to support themselves.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And what's sort of interesting is there is within Canadian law, we actually can't discriminate people based on criminal records, but of course employers ask these questions all the time. And I guess the issue is who's challenging that, because it's certainly a stigmatized population. So for example, one of my clients actually got a really, really good job with the government. You know, she sort of paid her dues, and she's got a good sort of employment background. She's got a good education, which is a bit, again, unusual, sort of based on all the information I already told you. But because, you know, we can't discriminate, or the government can't discriminate, she was able to get a job with them, which is amazing. But I think that that's something that's not really challenged often when employers do request that, because it really doesn't have to be provided.
Thank you. I've got another question here. Just curious, so with all of these barriers and the amplification of the issues that these women are facing, you know, that this is just a tip of the iceberg, but in reality, these issues are deeper, and there is no actual order to them. They're all very important. You shared this story of someone who can get a job within the government because it's fundamentally harder to discriminate in that environment. Are there other stories or experiences of success like that within different kinds of workplaces? And if so, you know, what are the factors that result in success for those individuals?
That's a great question. And I mean, a large part of what, like, again, the literature would sort of back this up, as well as my professional experience. Education is a huge piece of sort of employment opportunities, as well as preventing recidivism and encouraging desistance. So, for example, there is some literature that shows that the higher education someone has, the more likely they are to not commit crimes again, you know, engage in desistance. And certainly part of that is the ability to be employed, because the higher educated you are, the better your employment opportunities are. So that would be a huge piece of that. So a large part of what I do, which this is one really kind of cool thing, I guess, to give some kudos to our prison system, is that a lot of people can get their grade 12 in prison, and many women take advantage of that. They often don't have grade 12 when they come to prison, so they can take advantage of that. So there's been a number of women I've worked with who have managed to get that and then come out, and then we are able to support them to find post-secondary education, and that might be in the realm of kind of trades-oriented stuff is more likely. there are some industries that are more forgiving of criminal records. That would be construction and restaurants. So I actually have had a number of women complete a flags person's course, and I'll often see them on the road when construction's happening, like holding the signs and stuff. So those are some success stories of women engaging, I guess, in more sort of non-traditional work, is what I would say would be a huge sort of factor there as well.
Great, thank you so much. We've got 2 other questions lined up so far. One is from Alexandra. She says, "Hi, Amy. Thank you for this great presentation. I am wondering if there are any success stories with employment of women re-entering the society through social enterprise. Thank you."
Yes, that's a wonderful question. And again, I will kind of toot my employer's horn here. So Stella Circle, we actually do have a couple of social enterprises as a part of our portfolio of services that we offer. We actually operate a cafe, and part of that cafe's intention is to train people either in cooking or serving, catering. So we've had a number of women I've worked with have gone through that program and have done really great stuff and then found their own jobs in other restaurants. One woman I used to work with is actually, I don't work with her anymore because she's now my coworker. So she's no longer a client. She is now fully employed with our social enterprise, which is really cool. We also have a cleaning program, which is called Clean Start, and that program, or that employment social enterprise, has a number of contracts throughout the city here in Newfoundland and Labrador, or St. John's rather, not Newfoundland and Labrador, in St. John's, and that's what they do, as well as is operate cleaning services. And again, it's a way of training people with very little education, very little work experience, and to give them an actual skill and that kind of stuff. So that program has been pretty successful as well. And it's really cool because it does put people in a position of trust. They are supported, of course, through Stella Circle. So that kind of gives some credibility to who they are, and then they build up that trust naturally. And I don't know if this is really a good indicator of our social enterprise, but I've had at least one woman who was employed through that program and then got hired under the table by the person that they were doing. So that's good on her. Yeah, that sort of work.
Well, we won't ask for more details of that specific situation.
Yeah, but it just speaks to how she was able to present herself in a really good light, and then they trusted her without Stella Circle staff being around, which I think is pretty cool.
And so that's a question for you as well. In a lot of these situations, do you find that the stigma reduces after employers or coworkers have the opportunity to get to meet a person, to engage with them as an individual, or is the process much more complex than that?
I mean, I would think that that's a really huge part of stigma management, is that ability to just put a human face on it. Like another kind of cool program we actually have, this is totally not related to this topic, but I just think it speaks to an idea of putting a face on people. So when a lot of women come out of prison, they've lost everything. Like they've lost their IDs, they've lost their bank card. That's even if they had a bank account before they even went into prison. So one of the issues that we were finding is that when women would come out, in order to get income support, you needed a bank account. And a lot of women just didn't have a bank account anymore. So we did partner with our local credit union here in Newfoundland and Labrador to start a program called Accounts That Count. And they will help us give women a bank account, give us some money for the IDs, and then actually deposit money in women's accounts. And I'm bringing this up because I think it just really indicates how willing an institution like a credit union is willing to meet with these women one-on-one and really learn about them. And I think that really did a lot to decrease stigma for this, from a credit union sort of point of view. They got to meet these women. And I think things like that is really important. One of the things I advocate for a lot, or my sort of philosophy, is we need to like create community for women coming out of prison, because most of them just didn't feel connected before they went in. And that's a huge part of like, you know, wrapping around these women and making them feel that they belong. And I think that's a huge piece of the stigma management part, is to, you know, for people to meet them and they're not, you know, going to throw out words here, they're not crazy, you know, they're not dangerous, they're not any of that stuff, they're just people. And I think that that's a huge piece of it, is being able to meet some of these women.
Thank you. We do have another question here as well, from Kathy, asking, Amy, what are 1 or 2 systemic changes that you would suggest that could make the experience of women better as they are building their lives after prison?
Well, in particular, I think this is an issue for a local issue. We really do lack a halfway house for women here in Newfoundland and Labrador. So when women transition out of prison, and so when men leave prison, they can apply for what's called a TA, a temporary absence, which allows them to go stay in a halfway house for a portion of their sentence. That they would still be under the jurisdiction of the Department of Justice of Newfoundland and Labrador. They're carefully monitored, but they're living in community. That gives them an opportunity to like look around for programs that can help them find work. That gives them an opportunity to start work programs, to start education programs. And women just don't have that here in Newfoundland and Labrador. It's really, really challenging when you can't start that. Like I have had a number of women apply for you know, programs here at the college, get accepted, and not be able to start on time because they had nowhere to live when they, you know, when they were released from prison. That's, for me, one of the huge systemic barriers.
I guess that speaks to your comment earlier too about how there is no order to the issues, that you've got this whole constellation of factors and they all need to be dealt with, not just one.
Yeah, I mean, some people might argue there's a whole philosophy called housing first. So some people might argue how housing has to come first and then we can deal with all the issues. And I might be on that sort of philosophy as well, to be honest.
Yeah. Do you want to speak more to that?
No, I mean, it's just, there's just working in nonprofit around housing issues. That's just a philosophy. It's called housing first. It's a housing first model. And it just means that in order for us to help anybody, they need safe, affordable, secure housing. And once that's established, then we can help people look for employment opportunities. Then we can help people with their addiction or mental illness or whatever the other issues are. But that housing has to come first.
And Kathy actually just responded here saying, thank you, housing first, agreed. So I don't think you're the only one there.
Good.
We also have a comment from Angel. So Angel says, there needs to be more investments for wraparound services and workers from custody to community for the women. I see it over and over again. They do so well in programs and access services inside, and then go back into the community to the same people, places, and things. A transitional worker, familiar person they trust and know can support their growth and phase into steps. Then Angel also added outreach worker, transitional worker, reintegration worker. They need workers that they work with inside and out.
100%. And when I talk about my own sort of social work practice, that's kind of where I think we need to start to go. So I do prison inreach, and a large piece of, I think, the work is engaging with women on the inside, so when they're released, they have a friendly face, they know they can come to us. So we actually have about a 60% rate of women I meet on the inside will access my services on the outside. I am pretty proud of that. However, 60%, there's still room for improvement. But I firmly agree with that comment, Angel, that we need to, and you're totally right, so many women do so well in this structured environment, and then when they are released, that structure is sort of gone. So, and throughout this research, that's what a lot of women actually talk to me about. I kind of said, like, what's the main thing that you would want? If you were in charge, what would you put in place for women coming out of prison? And that's exactly what they talked about, that for someone to sort of meet them and do some preparatory work before they left, and then meet that person when they get out. So my program does pieces of that, but I would say, you know, again, for implications for my practice and my program, that's something I think we need to amp up.
Great. And we have a comment just from Rebecca. It's about the webinars more generally. Rebecca has stated this was a great webinar. I would be interested in joining more. What is the link to view upcoming webinars? We tend to send out emails about this. So if you join the CRWDP mailing list, you can get access to that. And I'll also type in an email into the chat here so that you can learn more if more information would be helpful. Regarding, Amy, your research, you mentioned a number of potential solutions that the women you were interviewing themselves noted, things like increasing services, housing, and buddy systems. You mentioned also the phrase kind of the people in power who are determining what actually gets done. Is there a match between what is being done in the system or what people are working towards and what these women are saying to you, or is there a disconnect there?
I think it would depend on how high up you go. So it's been, no one is on here from the Department of Justice in Newfoundland and Labrador, are they? I would think that a large part of the disconnect is around what priorities are when it comes to providing prison services, in the sense of there seems to be a priority in providing mental health services on the inside, and then the Department of Justice doesn't really sort of see how then that needs to be followed through on the outside. That being said, here in our province, it used to be that the Department of Justice was responsible for all healthcare in prisons, and our Department of Health just took all that over. So we're sort of in a transition phase right now. So I think that that will be something that will be coming forward, is that idea of transition of mental health services from inside to outside, because there is going to be health, our Department of Health is taking over. So I think that's one sort of disconnect. Other than that, no, I don't think there's a big disconnect in what women are saying versus what policymakers want to see happen. It's just a matter of how do we make it happen, I think is the issue. So for example, just the evenings and weekends thing, I don't think anyone would disagree with that. It's just a matter of how do you make that happen? You need to pay people. We need to get people willing to work weekends and evenings. It's not impossible, but it's a work in progress, I would say.
Thank you. So we're almost at 1 p.m. now. We'll wrap things up shortly, but Amy, I wanted to make sure if there are any last words or comments that you wanted to make before we close.
No, thank you. It did. The questions do make me think, so I really do appreciate everyone's comments and questions, and it's been a pretty good experience. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, well, thank you so much for joining us. I'm very appreciative that you took the time to speak with the CRWDP community, and I'm sure that the attendees are as well. We had a lot of people join, so I'm glad that people stuck around and asked really interesting questions. We will be having more webinars coming up, so please stay tuned for those with the CRWDP mailing list and the website and so on. Other than that, just thank you very much, Amy, and we'll end the meeting now.